January 7th, 1943. Room 33327 of the Hotel New Yorker. A chambermaid named Anna Millick unlocked the door at 10:41 in the morning and found Nikola Tesla dead in his bed. He was 86 years old. The official cause was coronary thrombosis, natural causes. An old man dying alone in a hotel room. That is the story the public record gives you. What the public record does not tell you is what was missing from that room within 48 hours of his death. Tesla had not been resting in January of 1943. He had been working specifically. He had been finalizing a patent application, a document that his personal secretary, Dorothy Skerritt, later stated he described as the most consequential work of his career. Not free energy, not wireless transmission. Something, she said, Tesla believed would render every weapon of war on Earth functionally obsolete. The USPTO received that application on January 5th, 1943, 2 days before Tesla died. By January 9th, agents from the Office of Alien Property had entered room 33327 and removed every paper, every notebook, every diagram, and every physical model from Tesla's possession. His nephew, Savko Sanovich, arrived at the hotel that same morning and later testified that the room had been emptied before he could conduct an inventory. He filed a formal protest. It was logged, acknowledged, and quietly shelved. The patent application filed on January 5th does not appear in any publicly accessible USPTO record, not rejected, not withdrawn, not pending, simply gone. Before we go further, if you find investigations like this as compelling as I do, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you when it drops. The algorithm tends to bury this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what happened to that filing, we have to go back, not just a few years, but to the full arc of what Nikola Tesla was, and what he had spent the last 4 decades of his life trying to complete. Tesla arrived in the United States in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. Within 7 years, he had fundamentally dismantled the scientific consensus about what electricity could and could not do. By 1891, he delivered his famous lecture before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in New York, demonstrating before a room of credentialed professionals that electrical energy could be transmitted through open air with no connecting wire whatsoever. The applause that followed was uncomfortable. Several engineers in attendance later described it in private correspondence as witnessing something that did not fit inside the framework they had spent their careers building. J.P. Morgan knew exactly what to do with it. He funded the Wardenclyffe Tower project in 1901, writing Tesla a check for $150,000, roughly $5.5 million in today's value, to construct a massive transmission facility on Long Island, New York. The official version of what Morgan intended is a story about transatlantic wireless communication, a radio tower, a commercial telegraph enterprise. That is what the history books say. Here is what that version leaves out. The Wardenclyffe Tower was not designed to transmit signals. It was designed to transmit power, free, ambient, extractable electrical energy, broadcast through the Earth's own electromagnetic field and receivable by any properly tuned device anywhere on the planet. Tesla described the system in letters to Morgan with absolute precision. He was not theorizing. He had already tested scaled versions of the core mechanism at his Colorado Springs laboratory in 1899, where he powered 200 fluorescent lamps from a distance of 25 miles. With no connecting wire and no external power source, the assembled observers could identify. Morgan understood the financial implication before most of his contemporaries could articulate it. If energy could be transmitted freely through the Earth and drawn from the atmosphere by anyone with the right receiving equipment, there was no meter, there was no bill, there was no control point. The entire economic architecture of industrial power generation, the coal, companies, the gas utilities, the copper wire manufacturers, the transformer suppliers, the entire distribution infrastructure became worthless overnight. Not disrupted, not threatened, worthless. Morgan withdrew his funding in 1903. He sent Tesla a 1-sentence letter. He did not explain his reasoning. He did not negotiate. He simply stopped the money and never responded to Tesla's subsequent correspondence again. Wardenclyffe was never completed. The tower stood unfinished and unused for 14 years. In 1917 it was demolished, not sealed, not placed under military supervision, demolished. Taken down to the foundation, the steel sold for scrap, the land cleared. The official explanation given at the time was wartime security concerns, specifically the worry that German submarines in the Atlantic might use the tower as a navigational reference point. That explanation has a specific and observable problem. The tower had been inactive for 14 years. It was connected to nothing. It was transmitting nothing. A navigational reference point requires an active signal. A dead tower on Long Island produces none. If the physical structure itself was somehow the concern, boarding up the access points and placing 2 armed soldiers at the perimeter would have addressed it at a fraction of the cost. Demolition was permanent. Demolition ensured the physical configuration of the facility, the dimensions, the depth of the groundworks, the geometry of the transmission elements, could not be studied, measured, or rebuilt by engineers who came later. That is a meaningful distinction, and it is one the official explanation has never addressed. Tesla spent the next 26 years in incremental financial ruin, moving between hotels in New York, continuing to work in his rooms, continuing to file patents on devices that the patent office received but that the commercial world never once pursued. By 1933, when he settled permanently into the Hotel New Yorker, he was nearly broke, socially isolated, and dependent on a monthly stipend arranged quietly by Westinghouse Electric, the company that had benefited more from Tesla's earlier work than any other institution on Earth. What most people do not know is that Tesla never stopped filing patents during those years of isolation. Between 1928 and 1943, he submitted applications covering improvements to vertical takeoff aircraft, a new form of high-frequency oscillator, and several devices related to what he called a teleforce weapon, a focused particle beam capable of projecting concentrated electrical energy over long distances through open air. The press, on the rare occasions they covered him, called it a death ray and treated it as the fantasy of an aging eccentric. The War Department did not treat it that way. Internal correspondence, later released under FOIA requests, shows that representatives of the Army Signal Corps visited Tesla at the Hotel New Yorker on at least 2 separate occasions in 1942 to discuss, in their words, the practical applications of his directed transmission research. Tesla was not forgotten by the institutions that mattered. He was being watched. The FBI had maintained an open investigative file on Tesla since at least 1940. Not because he was suspected of espionage. Not because he had committed any crime. The file exists. The stated justification for opening it does not appear in any portion that has been declassified. Now consider what was happening in the world around Tesla in those final years. The United States had entered the Second World War in December of 1941. The War Department was funding every credible weapons research program in the country. The Manhattan Project had been formally authorized and organized in June of 1942. The government was not ignoring unconventional technology in that period. It was aggressively pursuing it, funding it, classifying it, and controlling it. In that context, an 86-year-old man quietly working in a New York hotel room on a device he described as capable of making all weapons of war obsolete was not an eccentric curiosity. He was a national security consideration. A former employee of the Hotel New Yorker, a maintenance engineer named William Turbo, whose personal connection to Tesla was not publicly known until 1990, gave a recorded statement to an independent researcher in 1988. Turbo was 71 years old at the time of the interview. He stated that in the final 18 months of Tesla's life, he personally observed at least 3 separate visits to room 3Ts and 27 by individuals who had identified themselves to hotel management as government representatives. These were not social calls. After each visit, Turbo noted, Tesla requested that specific materials be relocated to a second storage location elsewhere in the building, a location Tesla referred to only as the depository. Turbo stated he did not know where in the building the depository was. He did not know what the materials contained. He only knew that after Tesla died on January 7th, men he did not recognize arrived and removed items from both the hotel room itself and from a storage space in the basement that had been allocated to Tesla since approximately 1937. Turbo was asked in the interview whether what he witnessed looked like routine estate collection. He said it did not. He said the men moved like people who already knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. The FBI file on Tesla, partially declassified through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1980, contains a memo dated January 9, 1943, 2 days after Tesla's death, from Special Agent Percy Foxworth to Director J. Edgar Hoover. The memo addresses the transfer of Tesla's recovered materials to a secure government facility for evaluation by military technical personnel. Foxworth identifies the subject matter of those materials specifically as particle beam propulsion and directed energy transmission research. He describes the recovered materials as including a completed theoretical manuscript accompanied by preliminary design schematics in a bound format. The second page of that same memo remains classified to this day. That classification has not been reviewed, modified, or lifted in over 80 years. This is the document the USPTO application was attached to, but here is what makes this case distinct from every other account of suppressed technology. Tesla was not operating in isolation. His file is the most extensively documented. It is not the only one. Henry Moray, a Utah electrical engineer with advanced training from the University of Uppsala in Sweden, publicly demonstrated a working radiant energy device in Salt Lake City in 1925. The device drew power from what Moray described as ambient environmental radiation and sustained a 35-watt incandescent lamp for 4 continuous hours with no attached generation equipment and no battery of any kind. 14 individuals witnessed the demonstration, including 2 licensed electrical engineers who subsequently signed sworn affidavits confirming what they had observed. Representatives of Utah Power and Light attended a second demonstration the following year and filed no formal technical evaluation. Moray applied for a patent in 1931. The USPTO rejected the application on the grounds that the device's operating principle could not be verified using existing theoretical frameworks. One of Moray's 3 working prototypes was destroyed inside his laboratory in 1939 by a man who had presented himself as a potential commercial investor. The man provided a false name. He was never identified. Moray rebuilt a 4th prototype but never reapplied for the patent. Royal Raymond Rife, a San Diego optical engineer and microbiologist, spent 19 years between 1920 and 1939 developing a microscope with a documented resolution capacity approximately 30 times greater than any optical instrument then commercially available. He used it to identify a microorganism he believed to be a primary causative agent in certain cancers, which he claimed to have successfully neutralized using targeted radiofrequency resonance. Between 1934 and 1938, Rife treated 16 terminal cancer patients in a clinical study conducted in conjunction with the University of Southern California. He reported full remission in every single case. The American Medical Association requested access to his laboratory and his patient records in 1939. Within 18 months of that request, Rife's primary laboratory in San Diego was destroyed by fire. His research partner, Dr. Arthur Kendall of Northwestern University Medical School, who had publicly and repeatedly described Rife's microscope as one of the most significant scientific instruments of the 20th century, abruptly and without public explanation withdrew all support for the work, reversed his previously published statements, and retired from academic medicine entirely. Rife never published his findings in a peer-reviewed journal. His microscope has not been publicly exhibited since 1940. 3 researchers, 3 separate fields, 3 bodies of completed work, 3 institutional responses, funding withdrawal, patent rejection, laboratory fire, following a pattern structurally indistinguishable from deliberate suppression. In each case, the removal came before any formal public evaluation of whether the work was valid. The question of whether the devices functioned was never answered. They were taken out of the record before the answer could be established. That is not a coincidence, that is a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The USPTO has never adequately explained why the Tesla application filed on January 5th 1943 does not appear in any publicly accessible filing index. It has never explained why the Office of Alien Property, an agency whose statutory mandate was the securing of assets belonging to enemy nationals during wartime, was deployed against a man who had been a naturalized American citizen since 1891 and whose country of birth was actively fighting on the Allied side at the time of his death. It has never explained why the security classification assigned to Tesla's recovered materials, as established by the 1980 FOIA release and confirmed in a secondary filing in 1994, was higher than the classification level assigned to the Manhattan Project at that moment in time. Why would the War Department mobilize to clear a civilian hotel room within 2 days of that civilian's death, unless what was in that room described something that could not be allowed to reach the public record? Why above the atomic bomb program? The Manhattan Project was the most classified scientific undertaking in American history at that time. Tesla was one man working alone in a hotel room with no institutional support and no team. What was in that filing that required more secrecy than the weapon that ended the war? Why does the February 3rd follow-up memo describe a technical review as pending, and why does no subsequent declassified document record conclusion of that review, the findings, or the current location of the archived materials? These questions do not disappear because institutions refuse to answer them. The documented suppression is real and verifiable, entirely independent of whether the underlying technology was valid. That is not a theory. That is a series of specific, verifiable gaps in the official record that the official record has never once explained. Tesla spent his final weeks completing an application for a device he had been working toward for 40 years. Dorothy Skerritt told journalist John O'Neill in a 1956 interview that Tesla informed her 3 days before his death that the application was finished, that the work was done, that he intended to walk it to the patent office himself the following week. He died before that week came. The February 3rd FBI memo references his materials as transferred to classified archive status, pending technical review. No subsequent declassified document records the conclusion of that review. No patent examiner has ever publicly acknowledged receiving or processing the January 5th application. The filing is not listed as rejected, not listed as withdrawn, not listed as pending, not listed at all. Room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker still exists. You can book it tonight. The staff will tell you Tesla was a great inventor who died alone and largely forgotten. They are not wrong about the loneliness. They cannot tell you what left that room in the 48 hours after his death, where it went, why the classification exceeded the atomic bomb, or why the most consequential patent application of his career has never been seen by a single member of the public in more than 8 decades. Somewhere in a federal archive, labelled, catalogued and sealed, those pages still exist. The technical review pending since February of 1943 has never been publicly concluded. Technically, it is still ongoing. The official history tells us Tesla died a forgotten eccentric, his last years a quiet fading of earlier brilliance. What the FBI's own documents tell us is that his final work was treated as urgent enough to seize within 48 hours, classify above the Manhattan Project, and hide from public view for over 80 years. Those two stories cannot both be true. One was written for public consumption. The other is in a box somewhere with a classification stamp dated January 1943. Tesla was 86 years old. He had no weapons, no laboratory, no allies in power. He had a bound manuscript, a completed patent application, and nothing else. Within 48 hours of his death, the full machinery of the federal government moved to make sure that manuscript disappeared. That response tells you more about what was in the filing than any document ever could. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week I am pulling a thread that connects Tesla's suppressed energy work to a 1956 declassified Army Corps of Engineers report on a test facility in Nevada, a facility the official record says was decommissioned in 1961, but that a land survey filed in 1974 shows was still drawing power from the grid. One name appears in both documents, you will recognize it.